Thanks, Mike. That was an incredibly nice introduction. This is a little bit bittersweet for me. I know quite a few of you, and I hope I told Mike I would try not to repeat myself from other lectures. But it's amazing, and we all know this as we age. Years go by faster and faster, and it really does not seem that long ago that we pulled up into Longmont and unloaded our moving truck. This year has just flown by. So the bittersweetness, the bitter part is that we're leaving in about 2 weeks, and we'll be getting back to Michigan, and it's going to be tough for all kinds of reasons: the scenery, the people, everything. And Hillsdale is a wonderful college, but it's been great being here as well, being in a place. Yeah, I've taught at Hillsdale for 17 years now, and to come to a place, it's been wonderful. I love it, and I would never take it for granted. But it's also nice to see how I won't say the other half, how the other 99% live, right? Hillsdale's not exactly mainstream. I'm not sure Boulder is either, but it's perfect. Well, one thing Mike didn't mention, and some of you know this, those of you I've met, I grew up not that far from here, but not in this state. I grew up in central Kansas, and all of my family is from Hays, Kansas and western Kansas. And so part of being here, and my mom, she'll be 79 this year, my mom is only about a 5.5 hour drive from here. And so I've been able to see her quite a bit. And so I've also seen her more than I've seen her in the last 17 years, and we're very close. But I've been thinking a lot about her influence on me, especially being this close, and how much of an influence she had on my own intellectual development. So I don't know, for those of you who can't see, and it looks like I'm the only one in the room wearing a tie, so I might take that off in a minute. But I've got my 1964 Barry Goldwater pen on. And I don't want to get too good. I'm glad. I'm not that good at politics, despite the fact that I have this title conservative. I'm very much, and I hope this doesn't offend anyone, I'm very much on the extreme libertarian side of the Republican Party. My first election I could vote in was 1988. I regret that I was never able to vote for Reagan. I love Reagan. I would have done anything to have been able to vote for him. But in my household, growing up, Reagan was great. And of course, we had a celebration when I was 12 when he was elected. We mourned. We thought he was dead during the assassination attempt the following spring. My oldest brother graduated from the University of Notre Dame that May, and Reagan, that was his first public appearance after the assassination attempt. So I got to see that speech. I've got my ticket stub. I'm not going to pull it out right now, but I carry it in my wallet. I've had it with me since May 17th of 1981. But so Reagan holds a very high place in my family, but he never touched Barry Goldwater. And that's still to this day, my mom and we can start talking politics, and Barry Goldwater comes up. And my mom's an extremely intelligent, very articulate person. And she still thinks that the country went wrong when we elected Lyndon Johnson. That's where everything, if Goldwater, he could have reversed the New Deal. He could have reversed everything FDR had done. But things really went downhill when we got Lyndon Johnson. In fact, so much so that my wife, who is a Texan, when we got married in Austin, Texas, we had our reception at Texas Women's Club? Is that right? And when you walk in, there is just a huge, immense portrait of Lady Bird Johnson. And I thought my mom was going to have a heart attack. She was so upset. How dare we have? We didn't even have a Catholic wedding. I thought that might not go over well. But no, it was the Lady Bird Johnson portrait. That was beyond all bounds. So anyway, this just gives you, I hope, a sense of where I'm coming from. So I want to talk just a little bit tonight about that strain of things. And please, I already have who I like in the presidential, what's going on with the debates and so forth. But that's not what I want to talk about tonight. I'm sure you can guess where I'm coming from and who I think is important and how I would like that to go. But what I want to talk about is not that specific aspect of the Republican Party, but I want to talk, or that political aspect. I want to talk about a tradition that I think we all have to be very, very careful about. And when I say careful, I mean that we have to make sure that we don't go to one extreme or the other. And I think about who we are, and I've been, as I mentioned, a registered Republican my entire life, and I'm very proud of that. As I think about the Republican Party, though, my ideal of the Republican Party is something that I think very much channeled by Goldwater and by Reagan, but I also like Lincoln. And there are other people I like as well. I don't think I like Teddy Roosevelt's politics, but I really like him as a person. I think he was a fascinating person, and I think there's a lot of that. Calvin Coolidge, Harding, not someone we would necessarily put up there as an exemplar of virtue, but certainly interesting. And I'm very taken with this idea of, all right, how do we understand who and what we are? And so the point I want to make is this, that within republicanism and the idea of the Republican Party, whether we're from the more conservative strain or the libertarian strain, there's a danger we face. And that is we want so badly to beat the Democrats that I think at times we come very close to becoming Democrats. And I want to explain what I mean by that. As a Republican, the thing that I cherish most is that I can be Brad. I don't have to be somebody else. And I guarantee you, and I see this at Boulder, though I've had a great time there, but it's very interesting when you start meeting people on the left. They may be very, very intelligent, but after a few moments of conversation, the conversation always goes in a predictable direction. You always know where it's going to end up. And my own personal experience, whether it was a kid being taught by kind of wannabe hippies who missed the 60s and wanted us to kind of be like them, or whether it's been in academia, is that any discussion in the left always devolves into really just kind of inane sayings. And it's a mushiness, a grayness, a kind of tapioca that has no real substance. And one of the things that I have always found so attractive about being a Republican is that I can be myself. Now, here's the danger with that. We have 50 odd people in this room right now. It's very hard to form a movement. It's very hard to form something that can take on a life of its own if we're 50 individuals running around. And yet at the same time, if we're not individuals, we're really not Republicans. And that is a danger that we face, that we have to be very careful that we don't force the others within our own understanding to conform to what we believe is absolutely true, while at the same time not becoming so radically decentralized that we have nothing in common with one another as well. And I think there's a solution to this. But I see this especially, and I thought this was really, really in the last election, the last presidential election, there was a lot of kind of groupthink going on, even among those of us who are not on the left. And it's a danger. It's a very serious danger. So this is part of what I want to talk about. But I'm going to read from someone that probably no one has quoted to you from in a long time. And I actually noticed, I looked right on the back here. I have the date. I bought this in February of 1993. This was in graduate school, so my copy's a little dated as well. But the argument's not. And I want to read this because I think it will lend itself very well to what I want to talk about with Goldwater and a kind of individualist understanding within the Republican Party. This is from Henry David Thoreau. And I think we often, if we remember him at all, we remember him as kind of quasi-environmentalist, someone who lived at Walden Pond for a year. Of course, what we're not told is that Emerson's mother brought him 3 meals a day. So it wasn't exactly living out in nature. And he was only an hour away from Concord, an hour's walk away from Concord. So he really wasn't in that much isolation. But what we often don't remember is that Henry David Thoreau went to prison, not for long, but he went to prison rather than pay taxes to support the Mexican War, which he considered to be unjust. And in his response to that, there's a deeply, very deeply American individualist strain here that you can find ironically in medieval England, but it doesn't really exist in England anymore. It was transferred to the Americas, specifically to the United States, and then is played out. And we still see it somewhat. Just the fact that here in Colorado, the kind of republicanism that I see is very different than what I encounter in Michigan. The Republican Party here, still very Western, still very rugged, still very open to new ideas. That's not the case in Michigan, I'm sorry to say. In Michigan, it's much more corporate, much more kind of conformist. So I think part of that, there's a Western tendency that I grew up with. I can just imagine telling one of my uncle farmers how to think. That would not have gone over well, nor should it. But I just want to quote from Henry David Thoreau here. I love the way he puts this in his essay, Fighting the Idea of Being Taxed for a war he didn't agree upon. He said, tell me once where a law has ever made a man more just. Once. One example. It's all he asked for. Where do we see that? And of course, his argument is that justice does not come from law. Law comes from justice. And the argument here that we find throughout all of Thoreau's essay is that there has to be a reliance on individual dignity. There has to be a reliance upon our own conscience that is conformable not to one another, but to something higher than ourselves. Now, we may all in this room, and I had a very nice conversation right before this talk with somebody that he and I would disagree pretty fundamentally on religious issues. And that's a problem, but I don't think it's a serious problem. I think it's a problem that we have to deal with because we often, especially in the Republican Party, we're going to have people who tend to be very religious. We're also going to have people who aren't. But I think there's something that we can appeal to that is not specifically orthodox in a modern Jewish or Christian sense. And one thing, and I'll just throw this out without really defending it at the moment, but I have the great privilege every fall of getting to teach great books, great ideas in the Western tradition. And we can go back to a great Athenian who was killed by his democracy. 600 of them vote to have him murdered for his beliefs because he was supposedly an atheist. But this was Socrates. And if we go back and read Socrates, and I'm not suggesting that Socrates is going to get us into eternity by any means, but it's fascinating to go back and look at Socrates' last words, where he says essentially, no matter what, no matter the cause, no matter the reason, it is never under any circumstances allowable to do wrong in the name of right. The moment you've done something wrong, you have corrupted what is right. Even if the end is a good end, you cannot achieve that through ill means. It is not possible. You've corrupted it from that very beginning. Well, that's 500 years before those of us who are Christian, before our own Messiah was born. And yet those words sound very much like turn the other cheek. In fact, they're very, very similar. And even if we think about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the idea of doing good. This was a speech that a great Jewish philosopher, Hillel, had given almost 20 years before Jesus gave it at the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I'm not suggesting Jesus is plagiarizing, but he's clearly within his culture as well, both Greek and Jewish. And so those ideas, which I personally believe find fulfillment in Christianity, they have been there for a very long time. And there's a strain of thought, a very ethical, moral strain of thought that has argued in favor of personal responsibility and individualism from the very beginning of Western civilization. In fact, I would say that Western civilization could not exist in any way without that ethical foundation that had been there from the beginning. And there's always been a counterstrain. Socrates was killed. Cicero, the greatest of all Romans, was not only executed, but he was murdered by having his head sawed off as he was being held down on the ground. Now, this is not an uncommon story that the best people we know in our society are those who are on the outs. They're the losers. And yet, of course, nobody remembers the name of those two men who were sent by Mark Antony to kill Cicero. Not one of us in this room, I would guess, knows the name of that person. None of us knows the 600 jurors who voted to kill Socrates. And yet here we are, even in a place like Colorado, Boulder, I get to teach Socrates' last words 2,500 years later. I get to teach Cicero in my American founding class because he was the most quoted of all the ancients among George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. They thought of him as a friend. Now, 2,000 years later, our republic is founded on these very ideas. And that is moral responsibility, and that is character. It's not based on a specific religious understanding, but it is based on a very ethical and moral understanding that we understand ourselves best by those who not only proclaim what's right, but in the end are willing to give everything necessary to make that right. And so this is the kind, when I think of the Republican Party, I know I'm making a big jump there. Sorry, Socrates, Cicero. Now we'll come up to the Republican Party. But this, to me, is the tradition that is so important, this tradition of dignity. And so I want to read to you, if you don't mind, if you'll humor me for a moment. This is a bit long, but I want to quote, and I'll stop and break it up a little bit. But I want to read just from the very first chapter of Barry Goldwater's book, The Conscience of a Conservative. And this is 1960. Here we are, 55 years later. How much of this still resonates with us? How much of this still matters to who and what we are? And again, I realize that many of us, even within the Republican Party, come from different traditions. We have different views. But I think there's something substantial in the kind of movement that we saw with a Harding, with a Coolidge, with an Eisenhower to a certain degree. I know there were things I wish Eisenhower would have done differently. But yet, here's one of my favorite things to think about. Sorry, I'm deviating just slightly. But just imagine this. If we wanted to look at the three most peaceful decades of the 20th century from an American standpoint, the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1980s. Now think about that for a moment. I'm not saying they were peaceful. There was the Suez Crisis. Obviously, we had Lebanon in the 1980s. But just think about that for a moment. And I don't know how many of you would remember this. And I realize for many of us, Bob Dole's probably not a good name anymore. But I remember very well, and I was only 9 at the time, but of course, very political family. I remember watching his debate in 1976. And he was a pretty good debater, whatever, when he became Mr. What was it? I will always support Mr. Oil or whatever. He may have had his problems. But of course, he had given his arm invading Italy. This was not some mamby-pamby guy by any means. He was actually a pretty good friend of my grandfather's, and they worked together. My grandfather from Ellis County, he from Russell County, before he became nationally famous. But if you remember what he said in that debate in 1976, and it shocked me to the core at the time, especially growing up during Vietnam, when he was challenged that the Republicans were the party of war, Dole just laughed properly. And he said, "Are you kidding? I lost this arm in a democratic war. You name one war in this century that a Republican started." And of course, Mondale couldn't answer him. There was no such war, not until we get to the 1990s. And even then, it's not officially a war. But regardless, no Republican president started a war after TR. Nobody. We were not involved. Our Republican tradition had been one of peace, and yet strong military at the same time. And that's a whole nother topic, but I do want us to think about that tradition of local rule, individualism, strong military, but peace abroad. We find that in George Washington. Entangling alliances with none, friendship to all. That is a deeply rooted American tradition that has basically been driven away over the last 3 administrations. But let me read here from Goldwater, 1960. He says, "We are daily consigned by enlightened," of course he's mocking, "enlightened news media as to political oblivion. Conservatism, we are told, is out of date. The change is preposterous, and we as Republicans must boldly say so. The laws of God, the laws of nature never have a deadline. The principles on which the conservative political position is based have been established by a process that has nothing to do with local, social, economic, or the political landscape of the moment as it changes from decade to decade or even from century to century. These principles are derived from the nature of man, from the nature of truth, and from the nature of God that he has revealed in his creation. Circumstances do change. So do the problems that have shaped those circumstances. But principles never change. They never go out of date. To suggest that a conservative is out of date is akin explain that on Fox News or CNN when you're just being hammered. Now, wait a minute. Let me explain the truth of the Decalogue. Oh, you religious fascist, you. Can you imagine? But this was Goldwater. And I don't know how many of you knew this. I've spent the last 5 years writing about Russell Kirk, an incredible man, the founder of post-war conservatism. Incredible. But he was also one of Barry Goldwater's not only closest friends, but one of his main speechwriters. And one of the things that I have noted, just going back through and reading about Kirk and Goldwater is, and I think we've forgotten this, how unbelievably civilized people were to one another. Norman Thomas, who was the lead of the U.S. Socialist Party for years, and Kirk, who was the founder of post-war conservatism, used to travel together for months at a time, debating with each other in public audiences. Barry Goldwater, and I'm not a huge JFK fan, but I don't know how many of you knew this, Barry Goldwater and JFK had already decided that when it came to the 1964 election, they would travel by train together across the country, and they would give a series of Lincoln-Douglas debates in every community, every major community in every state. Can you imagine 50 years later a modern political campaign being waged that way? That's amazing to think about this. And of course, part of this is an understanding you cannot change the world through a soundbite. Sound bites are meant to play to the weakest part of ourselves, to our emotions. We Republicans are better than that. We are so much better than that. And what we have to do is we have to figure out how to get that word across. And that's hard because we're fighting 50 years of defeat in terms of communicating. And yet think about every politico would love to have the charisma of a Ronald Reagan. It doesn't matter if it's Obama or if it's Romney. Can you imagine? And yet what was Reagan's great strength? He believed what he said. That was his single greatest strength. He had audacity. None of us would challenge. We may say he made a mistake. We may say that this was a wrong decision. But none of us would look at his speeches and say, oh, that's just fluff for everybody else. It wasn't Reagan. Reagan didn't speak that way. Reagan was better than that. Reagan would rather lose, which he did several times, we should remember, than win if it means winning unjustly. And there's something profound in that. It is a deeply powerful thing to recognize that sometimes there is celebrity that also does not lose responsibility. And that was what Reagan was. And he carried that with him. He carried that dignity. Remember, this is a man, even though I said I'm going to take my tie off in a moment, this is a man who never once in his 8 years in the White House went into the Oval Office without his tie on. Why? Because it would be disrespectful to every previous president. It's pretty amazing. You remember what happened when Reagan woke up from his Alzheimer's and he had moments of lucidity? First thing he did, he saw the nurse and he complimented her. That tells us something about who he was as a person. This was who he was. People loved him. Tip O'Neill loved him. And if Tip O'Neill can love you, anybody can, right? That's amazing. By the way, I have to say this. I'm wearing my old debate uniform, right? Khakis and blue blazer. We wrote a song in the 80s about kicking that tub of lard, Tip O'Neill, off Capitol Hill. So I don't know why that just came to me right now, but that's Tip O'Neill. That's how the brain fires. All right, well, let me read just a little bit more from Goldwater here. He says, the first thing that the conservative must learn is that man is a member of a species, but always is a unique being. Man's most sacred possession is his soul, which belongs to no one and quite possibly might be immortal. But there is also the mortal side to man. The mortal side establishes his absolute differentness from every other human being who has ever lived or ever will. Only a philosophy that takes into account the essential difference between individual men and accordingly makes provision for developing those different potentialities of each man can claim to be natural. We have heard much in our time about the common man. What a strange thing. It's a concept that pays almost no attention to our history, which as a nation is a history of great men who through their own initiative and ambition have led and bettered common men. The conservative knows that to regard man as merely a part of a mass is to consign him to nothing but slavery. Now again, what an incredible philosophy. And yet how often do we talk about that? How often do we recognize the dignity of the individual person? How often do we do that? And again, I would suggest just think about our own history, our own party. 1854, a bunch of men from my college, Hillsdale College, who were utterly ticked off with the bill that said Kansas and Nebraska could vote by mere majority whether or not to enslave a man, said you cannot do that. It's not a political issue. And so historian Ransom Dunn, who's buried about 100 yards from our driveway in Hillsdale, he got on his horse, he rode up to a grove of oak trees in Jackson, Michigan, and he founded the Republican Party. Our party was founded, the Republican Party was founded for the purpose of abolishing slavery in the Western territories. Do you think the Democratic Party was founded on that? They were not. From the very beginning, the Democrats were the party of slavery. They were the party of Indian removal. They were the party that wanted power and nothing more. That is the origin of the Democratic Party. And yet, here I am professing the greatness of Barry Goldwater, and what do almost all of our textbooks say about him? He was the one Republican senator who voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's what our students remember. How interesting. Eisenhower, not Kennedy, not Johnson, was the one who initiated movement in the judiciary to start attacking local laws that were in violation of race. And more importantly, Barry Goldwater not only desegregated the Arizona National Guard, but he also spent a ton of his private money in the 40s and 50s providing local blacks with money so that they could sue businesses that were discriminating against them. How many Democrats did that in the 1950s? I'm guessing not very many. So there's one good thing the Democrats did, but that's it. Really. And they didn't even do that much. Much was changed simply by change of attitudes, change the nature of the way we thought about things. But when we read Barry Goldwater here, what does he say? We cannot look at someone based on a mass expectation. We have to look at everyone, male, female, Greek, Jew, black, white. We have to look at them as an individual being, never to be repeated. And of course, what does that sound like? All men are created equal. There is a logic to the Declaration of Independence that whether or not the founders realized it or not at the moment, and they did, but whether or not they did, there is a logic that comes with that. At some point, you have to say, if we really as an American people believe all men are created equal, then we have to accept it doesn't say all white men or all Protestant men or all whatever men. It says all men, and there's no exception. And you have to recognize that. And that, to me, is the brilliance of Lincoln, because he did recognize that. And what party was that? That was our party. That's what the Republicans understood. They are the ones who brought in the 13th Amendment. We are the ones who brought about the 14th Amendment. We brought about the 15th Amendment. They gave us the 16th Amendment. They, under Woodrow Wilson, resegregated the U.S. military and resegregated all of Washington, D.C. We didn't do that. They did that. And again, that matters because we have a logic behind what we believe. So let me finish here with one more quote from Goldwater, and then I'll try and tie this together. This is what he says. Now remember, 1960. Don't you believe that the conscience of every conservative, title of the book, is pricked by anyone who would ever debase the dignity of an individual human person? Wow. That's pretty much straight on, isn't it? And I could read that in my Catholic catechism. Goldwater's an Episcopalian. Maybe they think somewhat the same. But, that tells us something. That's pretty amazing. Right? The conscience of every conservative is pricked by anyone who would debase the dignity of the individual human person. He lived by that, by the way. And also, I don't know how much, again, if I'm repeating myself or if I'm telling you things you know already, I apologize. But remember, Goldwater was not only a successful businessman, not only had he been the head of the Arizona National Guard, which during World War II was no small thing, not only did he always secure the American Indian vote in Arizona, not only was he incredibly popular, but he was an expert fighter pilot, and he explored Antarctica several times. This was not an uninteresting man. This was a guy who basically lived what he believed, and he was able to convince others. But again, let me finish with this. Today, therefore, 1960, he is at odds. The conservative will always be at odds, not only with dictators who rule by terror, but equally with those gentler collectivists who at home believe that they will receive our permission to play God with members of the human race. It's pretty good. And that actually could be said in a soundbite. That's pretty good. So again, what I want to get across, first of all, I want to say thank you. This is great you're here. It's so nice you welcomed me, my wife, and my family here for a year. This has been one of the best years of our life. It's been great. I've loved being here with the mountains and the air and great people. But if I can leave you with one thing, be better than our opponents. We are automatically better than they are. We don't believe in groupthink. We believe that individualism matters. We believe that individuals work best when they come together voluntarily in association, like we're doing now. We're obviously nonviolent, but I would ask us to remember tomorrow is the 800th anniversary of a group of men who did the very same thing to a king, King John, with the Magna Carta. They too, though they showed up with guns, I assume, very few of you are packing, but there they were. They showed up. 62 points. They made the king sign. Number one, you never, ever have the right to interfere with our religion. Number 62, you never, ever have the right to interfere with our religion. We thought that we'd repeat that in case you missed it the first time. Magna Carta is a great document. When the men met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, they were illegal. When the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, they were extra-legal. When the Republican Party met for the first time under a grove of oak trees, they too were extra-legal. Change happens not just because of individual greatness, but because of great individuals who come together and work for a common cause, but without destroying the humanity and uniqueness of their neighbor. That, to me, is the Republican Party at its best. Thank you. Absolutely. If anyone has questions or comments, I'd be more than happy to answer.